Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to Bioethics Grand Rounds. I'm Christian Verkler, the co-director of the program in clinical ethics at the Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences in Medicine. We are really lucky today to have Anna Kirkland time with us today on the medical campus to talk about her area of expertise. Dr. Kirkland is the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor of Women's Studies at the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. Dr. Kirkland went to Davidson College as an undergrad. She studied philosophy there. She then went to UVA and got a master's degree in government and foreign affairs. She then crossed the country to Berkeley and got her JD and PhD at University of California, Berkeley. We were then lucky enough to have her come here to the University of Michigan, where she has been since that time. She has written many books. In 2008, she wrote Fat Rights, Dilemmas of Difference in Personhood. In 2010, she published Against Health, How Health Became the New Morality, and Politics of Injury. Has been very interesting and well received, and we are joined.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Is this mic picking up? It's okay. All right. Let me know if you need me to adjust it. Yeah, this is great to be here to talk to you about this very interesting topic, and particularly from a bioethics perspective. I redid my usual talk about the book for this audience, which was really interesting and fun to do. So just to give you an overview today, I will just tell you what the U.S. Vaccine Court is. I assume there are probably pretty knowledgeable folks in this, what it is, so I'll give a brief overview. And then I'll introduce some major ethical questions about it that I thought we should discuss. And one thing that's very clear is that come from dramatically different epistemological worlds, which I'm sure some of you are aware of. And it's really important to parse out those different audience questions are. So I'll spend a little bit of time on the audiences, and then I'll return the slide to those ethical questions and work through them a little bit, and then we'll have time to discuss and ask questions. So just to I've taken an angle on the talk from the book, so I won't be talking about a lot of the things that the book covers. The book is very much a political and legal study of a vaccine court institution. I do draw on a lot of medical knowledge and read a lot of things, but it really is, I insist throughout the book that vaccines are political, social, legal. That's okay. Things and these controversies as part of a good democratic society. And I'm really interested in the book in trying to get at questions of knowledge and how we settle controversies in court. As it turns out, a lot of doctors are dissatisfied with some of the vaccine court decisions, thinking that they're too permissive and compensate for things that probably really aren't vaccine injuries. Of course, there's a lot of disappointed people on the other side who think it isn't compensating for a lot of things that it should be. But my view of law is that it can also often help us to muddle through in the middle and can cultivate a kind of reason giving and a kind of explanation that's there for the public. And those are the things that I really value, and I think the vaccine court ends up doing that. So the book is a normative defense of what the vaccine court does, down in all of its detail and policy. The conclusion of the book, I argue that the vaccine court is serving its original gatekeeping mission of keeping a lot of lawsuits out of the regular to stabilize our vaccine supply and all the things that it was supposed to do when it was set up in the 80s. It's become an engine and an audience for the vaccine court, and the vaccine court, as I'll explain, also pays people to produce that evidence. So it's a nice way of the possibilities to create evidence about vaccine injuries. It expresses our ethical obligations. If we're going to have vaccine mandates, we have to have some answer for possible adverse events. For those of you thinking about the social movement and anti-vaccine, know that courts do diffuses dissent by drawing people in drawing social movements to courts, which is a big thing that folks in my field study. When you draw a social movement into a court, it does certain things to that social movement, and it makes them behave that I argue are good for our society. And finally, accountable for their claims. You know, it's been debunked. Why do you keep saying that cross-examination is not always a great way to get at the truth, but it does serve some purposes that happen at the vaccine court. So that's the book, but I will move on again to what is the vaccine court and then to our ethical questions. So what you're seeing on the slide is a table, and the vaccine injury table is a published list of agreed upon adverse events that are automatically compensated at this court. The vaccine court is a no-fault compensation court. Masters in DC, located in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, like over a contract dispute or something like that. It was set up by statute in 1986 under the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. So no fault means that negligence isn't the issue. They're just trying to figure out, do you have a vaccine injury that's on the table? If not, the vaccine is linked to your injury, right? So in the most of the cases, if they're not on the table, these causation questions only. You don't have a Seventh Amendment right to a jury in these courts because the government has set them up to allow themselves to be sued, and the government didn't have to do that. So then you don't have a right to a jury. That's a constitutional question. But as you'll see, one of the objections is that people don't have a right to a jury, and that's the legal answer for why not. So nearly all claims of vaccine can't bring a regular civil lawsuit, say in a state court. The Secretary of Health and Human Services steps in as the named defendant, and pharmaceutical companies are protected from liability. Department of Justice attorneys defend the Secretary. So you have DOJ attorneys going up against the petitioners, the family attorneys. And there is a cadre of, roughly 100 or more vaccine injury attorneys who are comprise the petitioner's bar and represent families or individuals making claims. Use in children are covered and not other kinds of vaccines. So you covered regularly administered to children, although that includes the child. You just have to have gotten a vaccine that has been recommended for children. So interestingly, most claimants now are adults with flu vaccine claims because there's just so many more people in that category. All awards are paid from a trust fund. Excise tax on every dose. That includes the annual flu vaccine. So you can do the math, but there's a ton of money in this trust fund, around $4 billion, billion with a B. It fluctuates a little. So one thing that I'm trying to set up is that we have a fairly adversarial system with a very large and well-funded trust fund and not that many actual awards being paid. Attorneys' fees and expert witness costs are paid from the trust fund, win or lose. System. It was designed to make it easy for people to get attorneys because the attorneys will be paid. Very unusual, it's everywhere else it's eat what you kill, right? Court, although there are many complaints about how the payment system works out. So here's an additional view of the newer vaccines. And so what I want you to notice about it is the of injuries are short, right? They're not that many, and they're not that controversial, right? Anaphylaxis, right? Things that I'll talk a little bit later about shoulder injury. That's a pretty interesting one. I have a non-medical audience. I insert a joke here about syncope because nobody knows what that means. But I assume you guys do. So there's some cases, for example, this is the one where I watch my own kids, like, so they don't fall off the exam table, because I've heard all these stories of, you know, a teenager, supposedly teenagers faint more often, it gets HPV, sitting up on the table alone, just falls right out, damage their teeth, you know, you can get a pretty serious injury. So those are all compensated. And in one case I write about in the book, a young woman got a vaccine and drove off in her car and had a horrible car accident when she had a syncope a little bit after the vaccine, and that was all covered. So injuries are covered, and also things that result directly from the vaccine, like falling off the table because of syncope. So this slide just shows you compensations by vaccine out of the total compensations. And there have been about 14,000, probably more now, like 15,000 total claims. So people just, you can cut the numbers different ways to try to see what the compensation rate actually is. If you leave in the uncompensated autism claims, which is about, then you're more at around 30% compensation. If you take them out, which a lot of people do who argue that those are, you know, ought to be taken out because they're so big and so refuted, about a 50-50 compensation. It has increased lately, but because people are no longer bringing autism claims, they're bringing a lot more things that are more readily going to be recognized for compensation. Over time is a little bit to the court of the claims. So there you see flu, really big one. The next one over, the DTP, that's the old whole cell pertussis vaccine that hasn't been given in a while, but that's the bolus of early claims that the vaccine court was founded on, and those were all compensated under very, that's kind of the old era that I'm going to tell you about. So this next slide is my periodization slide. And it'll start to preview for you some of the controversies and why people who've been watching the vaccine court for a long time are really angry with it right now. So there you see that founding period. And this is doctors and vaccine manufacturers over the DTP controversy. And there had been a few high-dollar lawsuits. Manufacturers started pulling out of the market. Pediatricians became concerned that we would have a collapse of immunity because vaccines weren't available. Ronald Reagan saw it as tort reform, and people couldn't go to. He was able to cobble, squeaked through in 1986, and the court started hearing claims in 1988. So the first idea was, let's compensate these DTP claims. And it went back, there wasn't a statute of limitations going back, or they took, the oldest claim they heard was from 1918, actually. So they had this huge bolus of claims in the early years, and they were just paying them out under these fairly generous definitions. And those claims are still 27% of the total claims paid to date, even though they're all from this earlier era. Now, the era of controversy really started, and studies had come out showing that maybe the vaccine either were not as serious as were originally thought, or maybe weren't actually causally connected. And the secretary amended the table through the regulatory process to tighten up the definitions of things that would be covered. And this really sent the whole program into an entirely off-table area. Almost none of the previous claims fit under the table anymore, and the whole thing became much more adversarial. And when I talked to the attorneys who'd been practicing there for a long time, to them this was just like the whole thing went awry at this point. They couldn't get any of their claims, and they really saw that the era of actual compensation really ended there. And then with no injuries listed because we just didn't know. So those all had to be off-table contestation. Then the autism period you know, thimerosal controversy, 1999, 2000. Some of you around 2002 had so much paper they didn't have anywhere to store it. All the claims just suddenly came in. They were getting 200 claims a year, and all of a sudden they had about 6,000, all autism. So they set up what's called the Omnibus autism proceeding, which was, they don't have a class action, the ability to do class actions in the vaccine court. They don't run on the, but they had to do something to hear all these cases. So they chose 6 test cases and heard those in around 2008. This went on for a couple of years, hearing these test cases. And then autism was not a vaccine injury, quite resoundingly, and then applied the findings from those test cases to all the others and gradually have moved all those through. And now we're in this influenza period where the petitioners are almost all adults, based on the flu vaccine. And we've had some updates to the table, all those things that you saw there, like Guillain-Barré syndrome, and the flu vaccine is now on the table as an automatically compensable injury. Although that's an interesting one because the epidemiology doesn't really give any conclusive evidence about that. We just can't power a study big enough to detect that, but they're compensating anyway. And that really streamlines things. So now you get a lot, things are picking up. There's a lot more claims, but they're moving through faster because a little bit. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this is a statute passed by Congress, so all of its features are set by Congress and can only be changed by Congress. So there's only 8. But you know, as you might have noticed, it's pretty hard to fairly obscure without that many people behind it, and the controversy of the autism era has really meant that we don't have any new special masters. We haven't been able to update anything, and I will come back to that. So just real quickly, I talk about this a lot in the book, but I divide them into 3 kinds of cases. In the book, I really try to talk about what kind of knowledge do we have that seems fixed, that seems sure, and where have we decided that there is closure, these do not count, right? And so there are clear cases, right? And that's supposed to represent syncope, not a dead person. So you get a vaccine, you faint, right? We know this happens. There are some other. So thrombocytopenic purpura after the MMR is accepted, brachial neuritis after a tetanus-containing vaccine, arthritis after the rubella vaccine, the live chickenpox vaccine causing disseminated infection, anaphylaxis, and knowledge, I mean Institute of Medicine reviews and enough published research that convinces people on the mainstream. Now, autism, diabetes, all those things are in category 3, the rejected, meaning there isn't any mainstream evidence and no support for compensation for these at the vaccine court. And then there are these middle ground cases, and these are the autoimmune diseases and nerve damage disorders, multiple sclerosis, chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, and transverse myelitis. This is a really interesting middle case because there's not epidemiology that supports a link there, and doctors have criticized to see that. But what they do is they get an expert witness who is a credible person who can articulate a plausible biological mechanism of explanation. And the balance of evidence is preponderance of the evidence, 51% or 50% plus a feather, as the attorneys like to say. And the vaccine court is supposed to be generous with its compensation while also maintaining scientific credibility. And that's really tough to do. But they do try to do it in these middle ground cases and compensate for those. Actually, Guillain-Barré syndrome for the flu vaccine used to be in this middle ground, and then it was actually, some of them can sort of become more, okay. So I just made a list of the ethics encountered with myself, wrote about in the book, and are the most important points of tension and critique that I've seen in my 8 years studying the vaccine court. So let's go to them after I review the different audiences. And just to say, my view of bioethics is a fully political one where we can only really understand things by experiences and the political stakes in our broader culture about these things, particularly the full context of our society's care or lack of care for sick, injured, and disabled people. Why have the vaccine court at all? There are a lot of people who want to abolish it and think it's terrible. So, is it? Then there are lots of criticisms about how it's working. So is that? And of course, I think you got to consider what the alternative would be. So what does that to what we have now? And point 3 there, even people who accept immunology and are pro-vaccine balk at giving pharmaceutical companies protection from liability. One of the strongest things to justify. Maybe we can do that if our vaccine safety system is strong enough, and we're strong enough to regulate and strong enough to detect and strong enough to prevent adverse events, but are we? And what obligations do we have to improve the vaccine court, and in what ways? I said there's a list of reforms that people have been trying to get through Congress for years, and we haven't, and maybe a big push from the medical community would help that. And do we have an obligation to try to do that? I end the book saying, gosh, I hope they could do to fix this. Although I have also been accused of trying to hide the vaccine court, which, when I wrote a whole book about it, that I have folks that and I have some text messages I got from them that I will show you in a minute. And, some of the claims I said I would return to, shoulder injury related to vaccine administration. This is a botched administration. They do it like high. Teach people not to do that, and why shield them from life? Shouldn't we have to just make sure that people give shots in the right way? And then, a big point I really want to emphasize here is the vaccine court seems really critical for people because by the time they arrive there, it may be the last chance they have for lifelong support for a disabled child who won't ever be able to earn a living. And that only seems so high stakes, cruel, weak, and spotty social safety system, which, may be about to get way worse. So, a beautiful tiny Band-Aid in this sea of suffering. So when people assess their criticism and situate someone in their epistemic world, and what do they know, what do they value, what do they consider legitimate, because then the criticisms look really different once you realize where that person is coming from. Okay, so, and the toughest audience to argue with maybe is the very committed skeptics. The Facebook message that I got, are you that creepy person who works for the vaccine companies that produce vaccines? I read about you and I'm amazed what people will do for money. Keep getting those vaccinations and we will patiently wait until you reap your due reward. God bless your pitiful soul, Rick. You and Rick are not connected on Facebook. You will go in my slide presentations, Rick, but I will not engage with you further. Right, so I've been accused of interested in covering up why. I've gotten messages that say things like, I really hope everything's okay for you in your case. And then we have the National Vaccine Information Center organizing what's the image on your right, Vaccine Injury Awareness Month, which is October. It takes less than a minute to vaccinate a baby or a child, but a vaccine injury may last a lifetime. So this group believes that the US government either knows this or is indifferent to it and is conspiring to cover it up, that pharmaceutical companies cannot be trusted and are making so much money off of vaccines that they're willing to poison children. So opposed to the vaccine court, but it's hard to engage. And you'll notice this is a screenshot, probably the most popular natural health website and also extremely anti-vaccine. Joe Mercola paid. He's he's made a lot of money off of this and funds these efforts fairly generously. So they say, tapping into a more widespread concern that because of the vaccine court, pharma companies have no incentive to produce safety. They don't believe that there is any meaningful safety testing of vaccines. So I was at a major conference, 35 speakers, I believe, and everyone said over and over, they don't really test them. There's no test. A widespread belief that there isn't any safety testing of vaccines. They believe the FDA and CDC are captured agencies, captured by pharmaceutical companies that don't care about safety, and that the government wants to hide the existence of the vaccine court. And they believe that the 1995 table changes that I talked about and completely destroyed the social contract that they had when the act was first passed. Because some of these groups, National Vaccine Information Center was a major player in getting the act passed in the first place, but they understand themselves to have been sold down the river, and nothing that they see now is what they want, what they say they would have wanted the program to be. And this group is also that autism is caused by vaccines. Now, another really interesting and very different audience is the attorneys who work there. And they have a quite different perspective, and they are a varied group. Some of them work quite closely with anti-vaccine activists, and others are personally practice, and it's kind of nice when you'll always get paid for one part. And so it just seems like an attractive practice area, and they are not particularly anti-vaccine. About the organizational way the program is run and the way it makes their work life difficult. So they say things like that even though the burden of proof is the preponderance standard, that the write them on everything and have really raised the level of adversarialism very high and in practice higher than it ought to be. So for example, or they demand expert after expert after expert to try to prove a point. They say that it takes too long to decide the cases. Originally, the original statute says it's supposed to take just 240 days, and some things take 5 years. So there have been delays. Now, one thing I say in the book is that a lot of the delays are requested by petitioners in the hopes that some study that's about to be published will support their position. And then they say, look, I waited all this time to lose. So a lot of the delays are waiting for scientific evidence that doesn't tend to pan out in the way that they hope. They're supposed to get their fees paid at the end, and when these cases really drag on, people were not getting paid for years for work that they had put in. So they instituted an interim fee payment process to try to ameliorate that, but there's still, you know you're going to get paid, but it's just very, very long before you can get paid, and some legal practices are not able to withstand that. They say things they get are from people who waited too long to figure out what was going on, maybe with a disabled child, and they've missed injury or trying to recover, and they say most of the time when they get a call, the person's claim is time barred, and that that's cruelly short. So, and one thing I also noticed about them is they feel disrespected. They feel disrespected in the vaccine world because they're practicing in a world public health view of vaccines is very much the norm, and they are trying, they see themselves as trying to help people who've been injured, but they feel very disrespected in their world. Now, one thing here is a lot of their complaints could be fixed with statutory updates from Congress, which we. So addressing their qualms would be a very, very different thing to undertake than the previous group, right? Of course, the actual parents, and the image you see is just a screenshot of a judgment, a recent judgment in the case. Compensated parents and individuals and uncompensated ones in this rather differently. Now, the government has attempted to do a survey of satisfaction with folks, with claimants about how they felt about the vaccine court and their experience there. There was massive non-response, which is just a thing that happens. But then one also, if they didn't answer the survey, what does that mean? Complacency, that they're busy with their disabled child, that they thought it was fine. Massive non-response that we see in surveys, I don't know. And when they did make complaints, it was things like that the check didn't come soon enough and administrative things that, more funds and more people working there would probably help, but we have not been able to get. Now, the uncompensated people also vary internally in ways that matter. So there are, of course, the uncompensated claimants from the autism cases, right? Nearly 6,000 rejected, and many parents very angry and embittered about that. And then there are all the people who had much closer cases on a very wide array of claims. They're not unified in any way, or maybe they missed the statute of limitations. So there's a different kind of injustice done to them, perhaps. And the uncompensated parents of children with autism do form a significant power source for the anti-vaccine. Now, one thing that I always make when I'm talking about the dynamics of social movements is that one thing the vaccine court has done is by compensating a lot of people, it has left the anti-vaccine movement much in, because everyone who had a more plausible claim and then maybe wouldn't have joined an opposition movement. So the opposition movement is largely people whose claims were much more scientifically and medically tenuous. I'm interested in the book is what is the relationship between the social movement and the vaccine court? And we know generally that dragging social movements into court tends to quiet and distract them and de-radicalize them. So that is one thing that has happened, although the uncompensated folks are still out there. And they have the vaccine court to rail against. So then, of course, all of us are audiences of the vaccine court and are being served by the vaccine court. In government, is it working well enough in, to serve our social interests? He is just the cover of a GAO report from a few years ago. Anti-vaccine to try to get the vaccine court dismantled, maybe get the statute taken away or something. But this is the main thing they've been able to get was this GAO report, which said, well, they kind of take a little too long. They settle a lot of claims, and not exactly the damning picture that they would have wanted. To me, it sounded like very ordinary. Things take a while, and they do 80% of their business by settlement. But again, from a legal perspective, that's not at all settled. So, they're just cranking it through and settling, and the government don't agree that your injury was really caused by this vaccine, but we're going to settle this, and here's $300,000. And through at a higher rate using those kinds of techniques. Okay, so now that you have a full picture of who agrees, who disagrees, who has a beef, and what kind of beef, and we can think about the ethical questions. And I'll just offer a few thoughts on these, and then we can have a discussion for the rest of the time. So if you accept the basic adequacy of our vaccine safety research enterprise, get vaccine safety surveillance, vaccines work, and that they do actually eradicate diseases, then a lot of these questions are pretty easily answered. If the vaccine safety system works, then having this alternate court that protects pharmaceutical companies doesn't create a moral hazard because the regulatory systems are strong enough. And I would say that the most extreme critics have taken so much of our attention that we forget some of the other ethical problems with the vaccine court that don't require you to epistemically challenge mainstream science. And we almost never talk about political problems about inequality and lack of solidarity in our society. So again, the disputes here have such high stakes and have triggered social movement activity because we have such a who are injured by anything. Get lifelong compensation, or you can get a life care planner and an annuity to and counseling and treatments and things like that, but only if you can prove this causal link between. And so that's just a little tiny bubble in this otherwise rapidly falling away social safety net, especially when you have a child reaching the age of 21. The options for a dignified life get slimmer and slimmer. That I emphasize in the book and that I want to close with here is that because of political arrangements in our society, our vaccine safety surveillance system is much weaker than it could be. And we don't talk too much about that either. So for example, the vaccine safety data link, which is the main determine in a post-market surveillance manner whether a vaccine adverse event has happened. It's comprised of people who have HMOs at Harvard Pilgrim, Kaiser in Northern California, and a few other places, a few other HMOs around the country. We draw on them privately by the healthcare companies, and then they send de-identified data to the government out from these, I think it's 9 sites, comprising about 9 million people. The epidemiological studies to show causation. But if you're not in those, right, so no poor people, no uninsured people, no immigrants, I don't know what their coverage looks like in terms of different groups in our society. So in here, I make the point in the book, health surveillance looks a little bit more benign than other kinds of surveillance because we only are going to be able to detect rare adverse events if we can see a large population. And in this country, we don't have a national healthcare system. We don't have a national database. We don't have something that captures everyone. And here, being captured in this surveillance would be a mark of equality and a mark of care. And there's no political way forward to achieve that, it seems like. Maybe not. Where every single person in Denmark has a medical record, and this is why they can run studies about autism with 500,000 children and their complete immunization records. And the early studies came out of Denmark for a reason, because they have amazing surveillance system combined with very comprehensive national health insurance. That's a political choice. We can't see everybody, and we can't monitor everybody. And so those two things, I think, are markers of the kind of political decisions we've made in our society about vaccine safety and vaccine surveillance that, again, have nothing to do with standard anti-vaccine objections and everything to do with commitments we make generally to sick and injured and disabled people and the kinds of care that we construct through things like health surveillance systems. So with that, I'm happy to talk about any of these that you want to talk about or any other questions that you have. Thanks. And I'll go back to that in case anybody wants to. Yeah, there in the front. Well, that's a great question. And there's a big sign that says repeat the question, but now I've walked away from it. So the question is it for the pharmaceutical companies to keep producing the vaccines, or is it for the good of people? You know, originally, the original statute was passed very much under this fear that pharmaceutical companies were exiting the market. And we're down to one manufacturer. You know, it was a pretty serious situation. Impetus, you know, and it on that periodization slide I showed you, it's doing a lot of different things. Now it's compensating adults for Guillain. So as you know, as we expand them, concern about manufacturers leaving the market recedes. I still, or you know, if you're going to have vaccine requirements backed by law, then you the system, and this is the best we can get. Wouldn't have been thought of or justified under the original. It was all about injured children. Now it's adults and Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's serving a very different function. Yeah. Yes. So it's pretty small. And this might, I'm glad you asked. So there was a Supreme Court case that said, you know, basically the formulation of the vaccine and any adverse events that can't be detected, those are going to claims about that are still going to have to go to the vaccine court, but you can still get to civil court for manufacturing defect and labeling problems, which those are much smaller numbers of kinds of cases. And you know, the thing about the CERVA, you know, could you just sue for negligence and you did the wrong thing medically by sticking this way up in my shoulder and causing this injury? Probably those people could. Although when you have a contingency fee system, lawyers don't take cases that aren't going to pay a reasonable amount. And these injuries, you know, they're painful and debilitating, you know, when you can't move your arm or lift your arm for a few months, but people just are not posting the kind of damages that would a lawyer. So the question of are they better off with the vaccine court, even though it's not maybe serving the original interests, right? Because these aren't vaccine manufacturers. These are people, you know, it's injection related. It doesn't have anything to do with the formulation of the vaccine. And those folks are probably to the vaccine court because they will get a judgment, and they probably couldn't even get a lawyer to represent them on a regular claim because the damages would not be high enough. There's a pain and suffering damage capped at $250,000 that hasn't been raised since the original statute. And then people have wanted to add more things like counseling or setting up legal arrangements and things like that. And those have been widely supported, but not actually added. But you can get, you know, sort of lifelong rehabilitative care. And usually what the government will hire a life care planner to plan all that out. And usually the petitioner's attorneys have their own life care planner, and even they'll still have to fight out about between the life care planners how much they're going to pay. And this really about this, just that you're going to fight me about whether this person needs to go to therapy 3 times a week or 2. You know, and we have Department of Justice attorneys, you know, fighting families. It's a lot of bad blood fighting over the money after the decision, because they will pay for a fair range of things, but not what everybody wants. So tell me what you mean by that. misunderstanding your field of study. That's a huge issue, because right now the vaccine skeptics are arguing exactly that people have vulnerabilities that won't make themselves visible until you get a vaccine. And I write in the book, they have very interesting ways of self-diagnosing this, books, and trying to usually, and they can come up with some kind of story about why they think their genetics is likely, and then they want a medical exemption and things like that. But I do think once, if we could get to that point where identifying in advance a susceptible population, that would be a huge game changer. And right now, whether that exists and how much evidence we have that it does or doesn't, but it's sort of on the periphery, because, yeah, and then would you have national testing of all newborns about, I mean, there was a lot that came to be seen as possible and ethically required, and that, because that is at the core of a lot of people's arguments about their children, but without a test or evidence that we can detect these things. Yeah, and I didn't use the word loony. You used that word. I said these people have very little grounds to engage with, because things like they think vaccines don't work and have never worked, and homeopathy is really why we don't have diseases anymore. Kind of it's just an unbridgeable epistemic gap, and it's a conspiracy and all that make it give them answers to these ethical questions. Don't share their premises. Now, what you're talking about is much more widely shared. Like, lots of people have those concerns that are not committed to those kind of science-based, audience, all in all these different ways. So they would say vaccine choice, so I should be able to opt out of all of these things, right? So the vaccine court is not a safety net that I accept. Now, what I have found is that often a few layers behind that is the assertion that vaccines don't work and they're all poison and it's a conspiracy, that's all back there. And so, for example, practically everyone that I've encountered still believes that vaccines cause autism, who opposes the vaccine court. It's about that's probably 90% of the critics. And then but the folks you're talking about are resistant parents or hesitant parents. They're concerned about the pharmaceutical company liability if they learn about it. And they feel like if the pharmaceutical companies can't be held liable, that means something fishy. Therefore, I just want to be able to opt. Ordinary, surveys suggest, 25% of parents hold those kind of views. And that is very different from the organizational leadership core. Although I still find some of the people believing, that vaccines don't even work. And so why should I buy into that system at all? Because they don't even help. And that's when you get back to that, that's pretty hard I find that very hard to engage. Well, there are exemptions to that are often use them. There's only a few states, 3 states, where you can't get an exemption for just a philosophical objection. Avenue is open, and people readily use it. What you're talking about is more the legal compulsion that might justify the existence of the vaccine court to start with. You know, because I insist throughout the book, for example, vaccines are special. They're pretty much like nothing else. They create this widespread social benefit, but they do have this legal coercion behind them, and they have these hidden adverse events that we can't completely prevent, right? And everyone in the mainstream agrees on those things, all those things that I just said. And so given that, you know, 19 other countries have vaccine injury compensation systems as well. You know, in a lot of industrialized countries, it's pretty obvious that one should have something like this if you're going to have a product that people are required to use. Even if required doesn't mean totally, you know, you can get out of it. Yep. And, you know, the Waldorf school here in Ann Arbor has only about a 20% vaccination rate. You know, public schools, that community, but some other school, you know, you can look all this up online, like the exemption rates in each school, and they vary, you know, from depending on the kind of community the school serves often. But yeah, actually, Michigan's pretty high on the list. DC ranks them all. There's kind of a shaming list, which is actually extremely politically effective. It's, you know, you don't want to be the public top, and Michigan is in the single digits at the top. I'm not sure, maybe someone in or something for exemptions, more exemptions. And some of the states at the very top changed their laws and fell back down. The whole West Coast tightened up theirs. And we did recently tighten up our exemption, which takes them down a little bit so that it's equally inconvenient to get an exemption as to take your child. You don't just have to sign a form and get it. And then it's super, you know, then it's easy. People disagree. How easy is it to opt out versus should they not for opting out? That's just a natural growth of the program, because once the flu shot became universally recommended for, you know, 6 months and above, and that was 2006, or so, you guys probably remember, then it just was covered. That was a change that was never weighed politically or philosophically in any way. It just happened. So yeah, I mean, some healthcare workers are obliged to get the flu vaccine, but yeah, the vast majority of the adults coming through have just elected to get a vaccine, and then they get or something like that. Yeah, there's no rationale for it. It just, institutions just take on new things and change and become something else. I know the bioethicist Arthur Kaplan wrote an editorial urging people to do that, you know, that we should look at that, you know, lawsuits for kids. And with, you know, maybe with genetic testing, you'd be able to tell that you got the strain from that person. I don't know if any actual lawsuits have gone forward about that, but who support immunizations are talking about it. You know, you've taken a risk, and then your next child. I would think, I mean, a lawsuit like that certainly might be able to go forward. Again, you're just suing an ordinary person who doesn't have that much money, so it would be more of it wouldn't provide, it would serve a public function of but it wouldn't pay for someone's care. No, that's just a tort action against someone else. Yeah, the vaccine court, you have to have gotten the vaccine that's covered by the program, and it has to be about that, you've suffered an injury. If you know anyone who gets Guillain-Barré syndrome, send them to the vaccine court. They will get probably. We don't really know. Well, that's what everyone says. Controversy, right? Is the government hiding the vaccine court? Do we know enough about it? Why don't we know more? I mean, it's on the back of every VIS, vaccine information statement, that you get. It's on there, but no one reads those, right? No one reads contracts. No one reads up. No one reads anything, right? But that's part of the safety amendments that came in 1986, is that everyone needs to be handed a sheet that says they have, and it has a phone number, and it says there is time you get your sheet or your. So on the one hand, no one knows about it. People have been handed these sheets over and over and over again. So there's that. The other thing is that I advisory committee meetings and reviewed 27 years of meeting minutes for this government advisory committee. And they talk about this all the time. They talk about trying to advertise this more. And they had a consulting company come in and try and do a whole marketing campaign that was supposed to market the vaccine court and tell people about it. Then the recession hit and it didn't get funded. This is HHS. Their funding is like 3 month increments. They're just, so they really wanted to do this, and everyone had organized this, and there were presentations about talking about it, then it didn't get funded. So on the other side, critics say, oh, you're trying to hide the vaccine court and you're not. And I said this on a radio program. I said, well, they had a whole program and then it got defunded. So once again, do you want to pay for things or do you not want to pay for things? Like if you want a public campaign about vaccines, we have to pay for that. And so the very hard right libertarians who don't want to pay for anything are also the people complaining that we don't advertise the vaccine court enough. And you never agree to national health insurance or never agree to a nationwide tracking registry. Although this is the only way we can really detect these things to the very best, they would never politically support that. Libertarian, and so they won't support spending money on advertising campaigns. And one was ready to go. I watched it develop for months and then just, okay, we can't do that. No money for it. And it just never happened. Oh, yeah, well, very interesting. So the vaccine court judges are appointed by the judges on the Court of Federal Claims, who are themselves appointed for 15-year terms. So lifetime appointments, because they're not that kind of federal judge, but that's pretty hard to move, right? Say you're a president who wants to replace everybody with people who will give awards. You can't just replace everybody. They're some independence. So shifting the composition of change their compensations is pretty unlikely, I would think. Plus, it would have to capture the attention of this administration, right? Now, influencing represent HHS and influencing their behavior would be the quickest and easiest way. So that's kind of what I would expect, that a Jeff Sessions Justice Department might tell their DOJ attorneys to conduct themselves in a different way, maybe not challenging. I don't know. But that's something a president can accomplish just by giving an order to his Department of Justice. Otherwise, vaccine policy is state policy. He could try to replace people on ACIP in some of those committees, but I think there'd be a huge uproar about that. And that's hard. Those people have terms that you can't just replace them all by fiat. So there's Donald Trump is discovering that federal bureaucracy is the is a thing. Right? Who knew it could be so complicated, right? Levers, but not that many. I think, you know, and then he didn't even go with the what's the name, Robert Kennedy Jr. panel, which would have been a kind of way to draw attention to the issue, although so I would really, now the Department of Justice lawyers would never go on the record with me, and now I'm sure they, you know, if they're ordered to do something different, you know, whether they would ever tell anyone about that or what. I haven't heard anything, but I wouldn't have necessarily, because they don't talk.